House Speaker Mike Johnson is safe for now. That's the word inside the House Republican conference after frustration boiled over in recent weeks, leading some to speculate if Johnson's job was at risk. But there are huge challenges ahead as Johnson wrangles his slim majority heading into an election year. Joining us to discuss, Emily Brooks, staff writer here at The Hill and author of The Movement, a weekly newsletter covering the influences and debates shaping politics on the right. Hey, Emily. So that we are saying that Johnson is safe implies that was in question. Why?
Yeah, that's really exploded over the last week with a number of frustrations that were bubbling up with Republicans, especially as they came back from that 6-week break during the government shutdown when Johnson kept the House out. They have a lot of work piled up. There's not consensus on what Republicans are going to do on health care. They're figuring out the last details of the annual defense bill, which is initial draft, had left out a provision that Elise Stefanik, representative from New York, had really wanted in there to require congressional notification of counterintelligence investigations into federal candidates. And she publicly excoriated Johnson, blaming him for this being left out on social media, and went to the Wall Street Journal and did an interview and said that the frustrations with him are so deep that she thinks if there were a speakership election held tomorrow, he would not win that support. So that, of course, was an earthquake coming from her. This wasn't the typical kind of grumbling you hear from some of the rabble-rousers who are really vocal all the time, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is now leaving. This is a person who is a former elected member of leadership. Mike Johnson appointed her to be in a leadership position after her United Nations nomination was withdrawn. And so to hear that from her was pretty stunning.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of these issues that are on the horizon and potentially could be headaches for Johnson. One of them is health care. What do you think Republicans are going to do as those Affordable Care Act subsidies expire at the end of the year?
Well, that's the question. And the problem is that there's not a coherent consensus yet. Speaker Johnson does say that there is an upcoming plan that Republicans are going to release on health care. It doesn't really seem like this is going to be a plan necessarily to extend the subsidies. There are some more moderate Republicans who want to extend those subsidies with reforms for a year or two. There are multiple different plans. But the majority, I would say, of Republicans don't like these subsidies. They think it was unnecessary when they were implemented during the Biden administration and are happy to let them expire. Social conservatives are looking for more reforms on abortion measures to make sure that these don't apply to healthcare plans that cover abortion, which is something that Democrats wouldn't agree on. So there's just so many different issues and conflicts on these subsidies. And now Republicans are talking about things like health savings accounts, expansions, other reforms. So we'll be looking to see what kind of plan Republicans do put out with next week.
What do you make of all these Republican retirements that we've been seeing? It seems like every week there's speculation of another member that may be stepping aside. Seems starting to feel a little bit like 2018. What do you think the motivation for that is?
Well, certainly this is kind of the time of year where members are looking at these deadlines where pretty soon they're going to have to start gearing up for their re-election campaigns if they haven't already. They're home with their families. They're thinking about, do they really want to come fly back and forth all of the time to Washington, being away from their families, and really a lot of times be very frustrated about not thinking that they're not doing enough, is what we hear consistently from Republicans. There's a lot of conflicts about what priorities there are or not. There's some Republicans who would like to do things that maybe the Trump administration doesn't want to do, and there's some conflicts there. So yet these Republicans looking at, especially if they think that Democrats might win in the midterm elections, as history has shown, it's very common that the party in power loses seats in Congress in midterm elections. Then why spend all of the resources running for another term and maybe just retire? And that's sort of what you're seeing here. But like you said, this is getting a lot of whiffs and waves of perhaps Republicans could be in trouble in the midterm elections if people are heading for the exits.
What do you make of this notion of the use of discharge petitions? We saw it with the Epstein files issue. Seems like Democrats and Republicans are kind of teaming up in certain instances to circumvent Speaker Johnson. There's talk of now doing it with a ban on stock trading. Is there other legislation that this tactic is being considered for? And what do you think that says about the position that Speaker Johnson finds himself in?
Well, in the Republican majority, where Republicans can only afford to lose a handful of members on any party line vote, that means if there are a handful of Republicans who agree with all Democrats on something, then they can bend the speaker to their will. And that's exactly what you saw with that discharge petition to force a vote on releasing the Epstein files, which Republicans eventually overwhelmingly supported after Trump decided to get on board with that. On the stock trade ban, potentially that is something that does have a lot of bipartisan support, but there's still, I guess, on the policy details there, a lot of conflicts about exactly what that should look like. And there is still a lot of staunch resistance from members who see this as something that is not necessary. They don't want to disincentivize running for Congress for other members. I mean, they point to the congressional salary, which is $174,000 per year, but hasn't been raised in, I think, 2 decades. So there's a lot of issues there. But another issue that could be coming up under a discharge petition, one, healthcare subsidies, potentially something that's always been floated out there. If Republicans would band together with Democrats on that, that could probably be pretty difficult, though. Or another thing that Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania has mentioned is a discharge petition to force a vote on Russia sanctions legislation, to beef up sanctions on other countries. This is something that in the Senate has long been talked about, is ready to go, and has a lot of bipartisan support. But that's potentially something we could see a discharge petition on in the near future as well.
Does Speaker Johnson have a problem with Republican women? Nancy Mace criticized him recently. Marjorie Taylor Greene is leaving Congress. Representative Lee Stefanik called him a political novice, which made headlines in recent days. What do you make of the criticism that Johnson is receiving from the women inside of his conference?
It certainly is notable that a lot of those who are breaking with him are these MAGA women, particularly on that Epstein files discharge petition. In addition to Thomas Massie, who led it, the other Republican women who signed on were Representatives Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Nancy Mace, who are all very outspoken women and have been out in front on a lot of women's type of issues. And also notable that were all calling themselves very staunch supporters of President Trump and going against him on this Epstein files issue, which he called a hoax. So I think that is certainly a dynamic there. I will say that, other Republican women that I've talked to don't really see this as a Mike Johnson has a problem with women problem. But it is true that of all of the chairs of committees in the House, there's only one Republican woman who is a chairwoman, and that is Virginia Foxx, who is chair of the House Rules Committee, and that's a position appointed by Speaker Johnson. And we've never seen a woman rise into a leadership level above House Republican Conference Chair, which is the number 4 position, now currently held by Lisa McClain, who told me actually the other day that she's always had a great relationship with Speaker Johnson, doesn't really get the Republican women line that's going around right now. But it is true that there's a lot of Republican women who have been frustrated that they haven't been going up in the leadership ranks or chair more committees.
Could it be argued that at the end of the day, Speaker Johnson enjoys the support of President Trump, and really that's all that matters in today's Republican Party?
Absolutely. And that is exactly what Representative Thomas Massie told me when I asked him about the prospects of ousting Johnson as Speaker. Thomas Massie is no fan of the speaker. He said that he would not vote for Mike Johnson to be speaker today, but he said that as long as President Trump is supportive of Mike Johnson, then he will remain speaker because they are very close. I had a headline, many months ago that called Johnson Mega Mike, and he is certainly someone who talks about talking to the president often on the phone. They're always communicating in constant communication. So with him being such an instrumental force in favor of the Trump administration's priorities in Congress and rallying and herding cats in the House Republican Conference towards that Trump agenda, I think as long as Trump perceives Mike Johnson as being able to do that and not being weak, then yes, he will stay. But there is a risk, I will say, with this criticism coming from people like Elise Stefanik, coming from other Republicans, that is bubbling up all of these frustrations. If Trump starts to hear a lot of that and that changes his opinion of the speaker, will that change? So that's a little bit of speculation, but that's certainly a factor I'm keeping an eye on.
What other landmines do you see for Speaker Johnson between now and the midterm elections?
Certainly, this healthcare issue is going to be a major landmine. Affordability is the big buzzword right now. Can Republicans do anything more to address those concerns? And that will have the kind of economic effects that voters are looking for before those midterm elections. I think that's the big question. And the one big beautiful bill had all of these tax cuts, no tax on tips, et cetera. But one of the reasons why they tried to pass that as soon as possible was because it's going to take a while to see those economic effects. So that is a big struggle. And then there's just the regular government funding issues are always going to be a problem for the speaker because there's so much conflict between Republicans and Democrats about getting those things across the finish line. Republicans in the House with that tiny majority always seem to have some kind of problem with this bill or that bill. So getting everybody on the same page and focus together on something to go forward, I think, is the challenge. Without this one big, beautiful bill in front of them anymore, there's no unifying force for Republicans to go forward. So figuring out what that is and directing that attention of the Republican conference, that way is, I think, going to be the challenge for the speaker.
All right, Emily, always good to have your insight. And you too, people out there, can get this insight. You should go over to thehill.com, click on newsletters, and subscribe to the movement. Emily, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.